This podcast is dedicated to the memory of David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Farron, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein, and to Michael Mageau and Brian Hartnell.
This is Zodiac speaking.
A Classic Gunpoint Campus podcast. I'm your host, Chris Garcia. Robert Graysmith's Zodiac is the most important book in all of Zodiac investigation history. It's also the most controversial, and it's likely only somewhat accurate. But you can say that about most books. The criticisms about, for example, Helter Skelter, I would argue these are actually about the same level. They're an interpretation of a series of events by a person who had a role to play in those events. And thus, everything is colored by a certain perception. The difference is, Robert Graysmith is a much better writer than Vincent Bugliosi. Robert Graysmith had worked for years at the San Francisco Chronicle, and he was a cartoonist, and a pretty darn good one, actually. But he noticed, as the letters came in from the Zodiac to the Chronicle and to the other papers, that there were aspects of it that really caught his eye, that made him think in a very specific way. Jake Gyllenhaal's portrayal of Robert Graysmith in the movie Zodiac, which I'll talk about next, honestly, this is going to be a 2 or 3 part thing, really gets to the heart of what Graysmith was. In a way, he was socially puzzling out a world around him. And he would get an input of something, like the letters, something that had an unknown quality to them. And he would have to work through them. If you've ever heard him speak, if you've ever met him, that's it. You can totally 100% see and experience that. And one of the things he always does is he always takes a snippet. So if you're talking about something and you mention, say, the title of a book or something, he might take just that snippet of the book, even if it's just a tiny part of a conversation, and he'll expand on it and weave a web around it. And that's one of the reasons why I think Zodiac, the book, is so readable, is because he is doing this sort of almost nitpicking, but he's looking at individual elements. Now, those elements that he picks might not be the right elements. This is where the conflict comes in. People who say that Graysmith just basically had an idea and he let it through and he just cherry-picked the things that led to his conclusion. And they're not wrong. But honestly, it's hard not to do that if you're producing something that you are involved with. Think of how you tell a story of something that you've done personally. You don't give all the context. You likely don't include everything you did. You likely don't remember everything you did. And you likely give importance to things that may not be important to anyone but you. That sort of aspect to this entire thing becomes what's so important. It's one of the central pivots on which true crime rests. There is no way to be completely objective. And often it is through the subjectivity of your experience of a case, of anything, that defines how the case proceeds out from your telling of the story. This actually relates very closely to something I've said about film history. Karina Longworth you might remember this, did an excellent series on fact-checking the famous book Hollywood Babylon, which is a gossipy book by Kenneth Anger. But she was fact-checking it as history. But he wasn't writing history. He was writing myth. And in the writing of myth, he is exposing his view of the mores and the values of the time. And Graysmith, in a way, is doing that here. But he is doing that with a criminal investigation. I honestly don't believe he had Arthur Lee Allen in mind when he started writing, like proving that Arthur Lee Allen was Zodiac, was not his goal with the book. I think he came to that after several dead ends, which he kind of chronicles. And what's interesting is, since he had his own collection of evidences, some of which had been leaked to him, some of which he had gathered himself, including interviews, he was able to draw different conclusions than the cops had. And reading through Zodiac, it's fairly convincing that Arthur Lee Allen, though not initially named, was Zodiac. I don't know if that's true or not. I doubt it. I honestly think that Arthur Lee Allen is probably the best suspect we have, but I also don't think he did it. I'll talk more about that. The next series is going to be me talking about theory. That's going to be a tougher one for me personally because I always get lost in the weeds, just like Graysmith did at times. The way people in Zodiac are presented, Graysmith himself, Dave Toshke, all of them, is what I find more important than the actual working out of the case itself. Toshke's actually made to look, I don't want to say weak, but not nearly as impressive in the way he interacts with the case as, say, Paul Avery, or Graysmith himself, really. But he is definitely shown to be a good cop. And I think this is interesting. I've always believed that Dave Toshke is a great cop. I don't think he was a great investigator, necessarily. But a good cop, absolutely. And that line becomes very, very interesting. This is a wonderful book that everyone should read. You will likely not agree with it. The theory so far has moved so far past what Graysmith was working at as the principal Zodiac mass of information that it's impossible to say this is what happened. But, and this is important, what it presents is a time capsule of the, I wouldn't say prevailing theory, but a majorly believed theory. Because I've talked to a few people who were working on the investigation over the years, and they say Graysmith, more or less, probably on the right path, but just not stopping at the right point. It's highly possible to investigate someone well beyond the point of their absolute guilt, to the point where you're actually talking yourself out of them being the right person. On the other hand, it's also possible to stop well before you get there and still considering that you've got there. And in this case, I actually think it's a little bit of both. And I think he sort of recognizes that in the writing, that he realizes he'd gone too far and had to walk back. But I also think he walked back a little far. The next episode, and not going to say when it is because I don't know, I'm going to look at the movie, which is incredible, and I'm going to look at it in 2 episodes. The first one is about the movie as a piece of cinema history, because it's super clutch. And the second will be as a piece of true crime reportage, documentary, mockumentary, whatever you want to call it, and how all of that plays off of the general idea of the Zodiac. So I hope you'll stay tuned.